for coming out. I know some appreciate the effort. This is some material and some research that I've been working, and I'll start by making a case for reevaluating the narratives of the systems we built or the digital product we built by going over some of my experiences for the past half a year or so working in the Intel community. And so in Intel, designers in the United States intelligence community. So yeah, right. So yeah, thanks for that clarification. I'm sure some will appreciate it. So it turns out that there's a lot of search applications going on, and they need systems that manage the complexity of search in manageable chunks, right? So you need interfaces that provide, definition of data, and for users to contextualize the information and interpret their findings, right? And there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of impact of the work that goes on. And of course, if I talk to you about the experience of search, is something that has been written about extensively in the experience design literature. But that's something that underlies everything that we do in my work, some of our work at Berico and Intel. So of course there's interface patterns that provide all the discovery and interpretation of data, and of course being able to go cross-device. But it just so happens that if you talk about users, and this is where we started reevaluating user stories, because a typical user story, as a user, I need to perform the search. It just did not help anyone at all. I mean, if we're trying to build these systems that are breaking down complexity, but just to identify who the users are, I mean, we're talking about a global scope, right? With big impact in our work. I mean, we're talking about personnel in the field who have they're rotating personnel, and there's set tasks that they need to do, very time-sensitive, mission-critical. And then you have data scientists in command centers who are going through all this data and trying to provide some useful conclusions for stakeholders who are a small group of men and women who make decisions that impact the world, right? So that just gives you an idea of the complexity of the user base in Intel. So of course we had to reevaluate our user stories, and we started, we're rethinking them, reevaluating them. And so as a UX designer, if you'd like to know what it's like to be a UX designer working in the Intel community, we work best in cross-functional teams. And so here's where you have diversity of viewpoint, opinions, and someone will tell you that's true diversity, right? I mean, it's someone's opinion. But you're asking for different points of view, and in product development, it's all the trend now to talk about being cross-functional. So it's something that user stories, there's a lot of debate going on, and so we had to really reevaluate those narratives of the systems and the users. So our best bet sometimes is, because given the security involved, you can't just go in and record users, and ask just about any questions because of the security involved. So our best bet is talking to subject matter experts who can help us as designers kind of establish some guidelines for initial designs, right? So we work cross-functional. We're really extracting all this insight from SME's, the subject matter expert's brain, and just having that as initial guidelines. And so we're validating our assumptions. We kind of lay those out. We're working with the SMEs closely, and we're looking at patterns, interface patterns, just as an initial solution, right? Given that there's limited research that you can do. And so UX designers work best paired up with UI developers. And then instead of focusing on big changes, you focus on small changes on an interface or an application, right? So when you pair up essentially an interface developer with a UX expert, they can assess what are these small changes, and that's how you build as you go, and that happens a lot for designers, and it could be frustrating for some designers, if you really value research, if you value certain methodologies. And so at Berico, we've taken an attempt at providing, with some of our products, providing this search application. And we started noticing how a typical user story wasn't helping us out. So at first, we kind of reevaluated our methods. we established 4 core experience design principles. Best practices of interaction design, and you can look these up. You know, they're not obscure. They're relatively easy to see and to research. Also, this is important. Our design work needs to be relevant to the domain. I mean, we can glamorize what we do and our products all we want, but most likely it'll end up in not very glamorous location, right? A location with very limited infrastructure and, you know, outdated computing systems. And that's where your work is going to end up most of the time. But you're still going to be able to create impact. So that's another guiding principle for designers in Intel and for our work. They have to be immersive, easy to use for the users, right? Usable. And something particular to Intel is that the systems have to be usable and learnable. And if you think about it, this is very key because we're dealing with complex interactions. A simplified interface, there's a certain learnability. So how do you design for that, right? That knowledge transfer will happen soon when someone leaves their post and another person comes in. So that's part of our principles in design as we tackle some of our applications. And so again, talking about the users, we already talked about the global scope and the impact that it has on people. From the findings, from the outcomes of our systems. But you can't really pinpoint exactly the nature of the user. This is something that people in Intel will geek out on, is that the user is not always human, right? If you just look at a search, what it takes to make a search happen, there's an originator who's a user, right, who starts the search, and the response, you know, the server serves a response, and it includes a set of events. But that originator, as the user, can be a service or can be a bot, you know, or some kind of scheduling service trying to query your interface to extract data. And, you know, there's a lot of concern about, you know, who's behind these bots or this software that is crawling your systems. And that's a real concern in Intel. And so that's something to take into account. Our assumptions about the users not always being human. You know, you kind of geek out on that what you want. And so you've probably heard of this. It's all the trend, lean methodologies. But there's a lot of merit to it, right? And you can see like the typical user story, you know, leaves us with a lot of questions, and it doesn't fit well into even a modified version, an appropriated version of the lean methodology. So you typically start from the ideation stage, where, you know, in our case, we work with the subject matter experts, and we're trying to propose a solution and validate what our assumptions was real life. And then we move on to at times sketching those ideas, or even in paper prototyping or code prototyping. So we skip the Photoshop mock-up stage, and I'm sorry, art directors, you know, but we do appreciate the work of visual designers, but you kind of pair up with them. And then you move on to validating those assumptions, right? And so you focused on UI metrics. You focused, hopefully, on customer insights, or insights from your research talking to the SMEs. And that's how you kind of iterate, right? That's an appropriated lean method in a nutshell. And you can Google this and look it up on Twitter. There's a lot of movement behind it. But what you focus on is those pain points. I know Jim Lane a few months ago kind of summarized every kind of journey map that exists in a nice presentation here at NoVA UX. And so what these journey maps do is that they help you see where along in the ecosystem, or what your idea of the ecosystem is, you know, where is the system falling short, where are those pain points, and that's something that at Berico we take into account. You know, these ideas are real life, and then we can target those pain points and interpret them as metrics, right, that will drive the success of our interfaces, of our applications. And so I hope to have made a case of why, at least in our experience, user stories fall short, and they can be improved, and we should reevaluate them as far as the narratives of the systems that we're designing, right? You know, Agile was great, but we have to see beyond typical Agile engineering stories. You know, back in the 90s or the late 80s, this was great, right? It helped revolutionize what projects we put together. But not everybody doing development looks like that anymore. You know, it's a more diverse world. It's a whole lot complicated world with things that, you know, it took someone really visionary to see what was coming. So again, reevaluating agile methodology. And the thing about user stories is that they annoy instead of inspire, right? Especially if you're trying to build something that's unknown, focusing too much on a small task, and having millions of tasks launch at you as a designer, as a developer, we can reevaluate that. And that's kind of like the case for design stories. You know, designers are trying to break down complexity. Developers are measuring complexity. So when these two worlds come together, that's why reevaluating those narratives, right, and coming up with these design stories, there's a good case for it to be more efficient. And also, user stories have to be rewritten a lot. I don't know how many times you've been at meetings where people are saying, yeah, what user story was that? Or people are saying, yeah, it was user story AB27-B. No, -C. So nobody's really engaged, right? It just becomes like a number, a label, and just a cold like list of tasks or a cold command. It doesn't really reflect the reality, and that's something that I'll tackle on. At best, user stories give you this idea that you can walk into a room, sell an idea to a client, come back a few months later with a nice slide deck, and you have 1,000 user stories listed. That's called big strategy. I personally, I think it's a fantasy, right? Because the big strategy helps you focus on imagined problems, and when you imagine problems, guess what? You're focusing and you're coming up with imagined solutions. What we want to do is focus on real-world problems, right? And I think and I believe that design stories can help us get there because we rethink things. And speaking of thinking, I also know there was a design thinking workshop last month. But design thinking can be more than just an empty slogan, right? It can inspire developers and inspire teams to think big, right? And to not focus so much on the little, but see the big picture and ask what is the value of what's being created. And this is how user stories become more useful, but employing design thinking into these design stories, into the narratives. And so I believe that is a true meaning of success. When everyone owns the design, right? The design is not just what the designers own, right? Or the developers, and then you have cases that developers kind of meet over here and they kind of keep the designers out of the loop, and you know, it's awful. But when done right, these narratives, they can unite a team, they can inspire, and you know, that's a true meaning of success. We measure success differently as far as product development. Primarily, we'll never ever see a list of tasks to do. Right? I mean, something that you just have to click done, check, you know, and send off to somebody else. So they become more useful when we employ design thinking for the narratives and for the stories in our systems. And they promote holistic thinking. And the value I place on holistic thinking is that it helps us to be selective in our planning and architecture. And this is important so we don't stifle innovation, right? And so we're moving as we go, we're learning, we're focusing on those insights, and we'll be much more successful for what we do. And so that's kind of like more or less a layout or a plan to rethink user stories. So now design stories, right, to make it more engaging. This is a sculpture from Canada, some ladies gossiping, right? And there's sometimes gossip is so good, you want to hear it, you know you shouldn't, but then you want to repeat it after you do, but you're just engaged with a narrative. And so I come to think, what if those design stories are so engaging like gossip, right? So we have to completely rethink them, or reevaluate them as a way to unite a cross-functional team. So what are the components of design stories? Well, the context, right? You probably heard a lot about analytics. We can figure out to the decimal, you know, where in a system, in an experience, something is falling short. You know, what point, at what feature, you know, almost at what time something is crashing and the user is completely feeling frustrated. But when you talk about context, you also talk about what a user's life is, as a human, what their life and what they go through. And that's super important when we want to create information symmetry. When we create apps or systems or interfaces that are meaningful, we have to take into account their life. And that's a good one to look up, how we create information symmetry. And then also there's system thinking. That's another component of design stories. How are those components that we're designing, how are they supporting that context that we want to enhance, right? We want to provide value to. And of course, these usually take the form of flowcharts or sketch flows, right? Where we're mapping relationships, how those components are put together. Lane Haley out in Los Angeles, she talks about this, writing stories that include development and design work together. So it has to be rethought. As an idea, right? Speaking of system thinking. Usability, I mean, I don't have to convince most people here, but if our system has all the disruption, all the technological breakthrough, but it lacks basic usability, it's going to undermine everything. And so we have to focus on what are those UI metrics to improve, right? And of course, there's usability testing. But as a way to improve what we're working on. And lastly, the visual design component. This is important because we want to create interfaces that are beautiful, enjoyable, and are well organized. And that helps us to get closer and closer to achieving reflective design. And when you achieve reflective design or reflective experience, you're creating something that is meaningful to a user. And so that's why there's a good emphasis on the visual design, how things can complement. And that's something that Vince Lombardi says. You want to take on an established brand, you want to take them down on creating a better reflective design experience, right? And people just want to be all over your product, essentially. Reflective design is essentially when you take into account a user, and I put it as a user sees themselves, like reflected in the app or the interface, and you're creating something meaningful. There's a good article on the Wikipedia. So it deals with information symmetry, creating that reflection. Does anyone have another take on, this is... All right, well... It's beyond like the browser. It's like creating something very relevant to the user. You see, there's a good article on Wikipedia. Go ahead.
Perhaps immersive.
Very immersive. Yeah. Okay, on the subject of reflective design, everyone loved the iPod when they came out. Most people, right? You saw the commercial. You wanted to feel cool, like the people, jumping around. But there's way better interfaces for navigating music at the time. But they just didn't have what the iPod had. The Zune player, had a much better, in my opinion, and any UI expert can tell you, it was much more efficient in navigating the files and the music, but it just didn't have that reflection that the iPod had. So I know it just kind of gets, into that art talk, but there's, look up what Vince Lombardi says in his book, Why We Fail, and he has a chapter on reflective design, reflective experiences. So. Yeah, no, I love it. I love the question. Yeah, so if you want to, just bring it if you have questions as we discuss. That's cool. Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Yeah, thanks for keeping me on the frame. So again, I think Sketchnotes are useful for the form that these design stories can be displayed in, right? They provide a good way to define and a good way to explore, right? Connections. And so Sketchnotes are good for when you're trying to define the context or lay it out on paper. And then, of course, flow sketches for the diagrams when you're trying to map relationships. And UI sketches, in my opinion, can be used for laying out the usability factors and the interface design when you put them together. So those are the components of design stories that I'm proposing, and some of the proposed ways that it could be displayed. So how, right? How can we now put this in a framework to really put down design stories on paper or on a whiteboard or digitized? Well, I used to do a bit of screenwriting back in the day, and I focus on the work from screenwriters and script editors it's set that they have a lot of ideation methods. And it says that they control the show or they control the story because they're working closely with the director of a film, right? And think of a film as a story. And they keep track of what deviations have been made and also what's been included and what's left. And so they work closely with the directors of a film. So they have a lot of ideation methods for putting down stories. Story pitches, a teaser, or a documentary statement, or a proposal that leads to a treatment. And that's what you have like outlined, both the shots with the audio and the narration. So we can borrow, I venture to say we can borrow a lot from screenwriters, from their methods to start putting down these design stories, right? So for one thing, working closely with the director, they help achieve continuity and help make sure that the film is put together, right? And so after they come up with those ideas and they kind of have that story pitch or that treatment, they set off collaboration into production, right? And so I see kind of what we do as UX designers in cross-functional teams, not so much like the big Hollywood blockbuster productions, but an indie documentary film crew, right? That is very real life. You're out there, and it's very real. It's raw. And so there's numerous roles, from a production designer, right, to the lighting technician, and all these people come together and put everything on film and record the audio. And it also follows the script, right, which is that story. So you'll kind of know where I'm going with this. And then they enter this validation stage where the director puts together a film, right? And they kind of see it put together from beginning to finale, the whole narrative, right? After all that production and after all that collaboration, and it's kind of like a validation stage, right? And then they move forward with the film. So it all starts from the story teaser. Now, the story teaser is something that builds enthusiasm, right? And you're onto something. So it has to answer. If people listen to your pitch or your teaser, it kind of answers to them, how the film can be casted, what other films it resembles, right? So it kind of sounds familiar when you're building a product or you're building an app, right? How it can be marketed, how much it's going to cost. Lo and behold, all from a well-put narrative that's engaging, but that's concise, right? So there's a method to it. Here's a sample documentary statement, right? It's called The Swimming Lesson, and it's kind of like an urban story with a few of any minority kids, and it's kind of like a rough area. So you kind of read that, and you can determine, I want to watch this film or not, I want to fund your film or not, right? You kind of engaged or not, but it's real, right? So that's how you. So there's a method to putting together a documentary proposal, or actually the statement, right? A usual template looks like this. In life, I believe, right? This is almost like your context information, right? When we talk about what's the real life of the user, right? What's that idea that you want to explore? Kind of what documentary writers do. And then you're talking about the conflict, right? What's going to make up? What's the narrative? What's the conflict in your film? That sounds a lot like the backbone of the system, right? Like what are those interactions? And then you focus on what you want the audience to feel and understand. So that reminds me of understanding our users. So we have a framework to put together a short story teaser for our work, right? Put a teaser for a design story. We focus on the usefulness of what we're building, what experience we want to endorse, right, or subvert, what we want to do with our system, and then what value we're providing, and that involves reflective design. So we can discuss that. And so writers put this pitch together, and then they move on to a more formal proposal, right? And kind of like designers or screenwriters, eventually you have to get in front of a crowd and propose your idea, right? And confront an audience and just speak out, and share your idea. So screenwriters do this, and specifically the documentary proposal has a lot of well laid out sections, and so it gives a producer an idea if they want to fund your film. or move through. And I think this is key when we rethink design stories or rethink the narratives of our systems. Again, these are very well laid out. These could be very thick also. They also provide budgetary information. But the main sections that I focus on from a documentary proposal and borrowing that for design stories have to do with the topic, the audience, the structure, and the style. And I think they're a good fit for design stories. As far as like, we want to focus on the context, right? That's more than just screen size. You know, it's trendy to say that also. There's a lot involved in the context of an app. There's usability factors. There's the system. That's, you know, how the experience is going to be supported, and the visual design. So these are like the 4 core components of a design story. Then you can use the other sections to kind of go beyond a design brief, essentially, but put a nice narrative, an idea for a very real-life app. I mean, I assume we all want to work on things that are real life, not necessarily fantasy products, right? So that's comparing like documentaries to fantasy films. Our work, we want to solve real-world problems. And I think a documentary proposal can help us. We can borrow from that work. And so one easy-to-use method or format is a documentary script card, right? So all this work has been done for the narrative. And so documentary writers, they hand to the producer or the film crew, these cards that kind of have the cues for the camera and a bit of narration information and enough context, right, for just the film crew to just take that and just shoot the sequences or shoot the interviews. And it just gives some good ideas. So we can borrow from that. So I've appropriated script cards for design stories. And this is what I propose, right? So we kind of have on top, you kind of, you see the 4 lines of the design story bit. You can kind of write out your pitch, right? Those 3 sections where we focus on understanding the users, the system, and the value we're providing, right? The 4 components of design stories, which are context, system, usability, and visual design. So you want to almost capture that in that sentence. But then you kind of lay them out. To the left, you will have, you know, a section with 2 boxes. On top, you have your context, which I believe these are almost like infographics can be as a way to define the setting or the context. Below it, you have your more formal flow sketches that you're mapping relationships, right? And what's key is to show or suggest how your components are supporting the experience, right? And then to the right is the more familiar UI sketches, right? Essentially, you want to target usability and visual design. So I'm hoping that, wait, clicked the wrong button. Okay, so okay, all right, so I propose an activity. If you brought your moleskin or some paper, just to kind of do some quick sketch, you don't have to share with anybody. We're not going to ask you to get up here, but just kind of work with me through the process of putting a design story together. And feel free to, you know, put it up on Twitter with hashtag NoVA afterwards, so we can just share, you know, with the different thinking. So it's almost like a cross-functional team exercise, you know, how we're going to put these narratives together. So I'm pretty sure we enjoyed the pizza tonight. So let's focus on building a custom pizza app to order custom pizza based on your location, right? And have it as a way that makes the experience of putting a pizza together, it's immersive, right? And it's enjoyable, right? So let's just here's kind of like some jargon, right? We're building a custom pizza ordering app. We want consumers to create the perfect pizza, right? That's meaningful. Have it delivered fast. Use geolocation information, right, to know what's available, what's nearby. Kind of lets them know how long it could take to have it delivered. Some parameters, right? If you're very technical, there's 4 types of pizza to begin. You can order multiple pizzas, multiple toppings. And essentially just focus on making the experience of creating the pizza enjoyable. All right, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but we kind of have like the diagram for it, right? You kind of want to put a box long rectangle on the top where you will kind of write out a pitch for the design story, right? This custom pizza ordering app, right? So you want to make it enjoyable. You want to use geolocation information, right, and make it relevant. So that's kind of like your design story, right, or your pitch for it. I mean, this whole schematic or this whole format will be that design story. Then below it, we want to maybe do an infographic that will kind of show mapping information, right? And it will show some relationships to nearby pizza places, right? And I think about the context a lot because depending on where you are is how you feel about pizza, right? Some people are very intense about their pizza or the brands, the gourmet versus just the Papa John's or the Domino's. So you kind of start thinking about context. There's more to it than just where you are, where you're located. There's a lot of information. So maybe some sketches, some infographics, something that will help you define the context, right? And it's totally up to you. And then below it, the flow sketches of a system, right? This is where you get into the API sketching or how the different components will talk to each other. Perhaps it could be your basic e-commerce workflow, you know, to check out, but also suggest some of the micro interactions. Well, not the micro interactions, that's after. But essentially, maybe suggest like what are some of the user flow, right? That will be required in the act of creating a pizza and finding out which kind you want. So it just helps you think it through a little bit. Then the usability. You know, what are some suggestions in the form of sketches or UI sketches that can be made for the usability that will be involved? What are some factors, right? And of course, the visual design. This is the part that everybody likes, most people like to do, at least on a superficial level. You're focusing on the micro interactions, right, that will be required as part of the workflow in the different screens. So now you can design maybe like a search bar with some mapping component beneath it and like a panel. Those are just some suggestions, right? So what we just did is essentially we just talked out a narrative, at least for an overarching system, for developing an app for ordering custom pizza online and have it delivered fast. Or it's just a method that I'm proposing. It's not a definitive guide. I think when you talk to other designers around the world and locally, everybody just comes up with the same ideas, and we can really reevaluate these user stories, right? So the other approach would have likely been, as a user, I need to order 4 types of pizza. You know, so maybe you're noticing the difference, right? It's just much more engaging to be concise and enthusiastic and excited about at least the big narrative, your intent. And who knows? Maybe each of the components now will require their own design story, where you're kind of, you know, breaking down that complexity, right? So that's design stories, a proposal for design stories. So again, we discussed how hopefully it'll be more useful for breaking down the complexity. And what's we've been doing at Berico is that it helps us to be continuous in our design process, right? I'm big on biomimicry research and establishing the links between biomimicry and digital design as far as process. And so now our process is not necessarily linear. We're clearly defined stages, right? Now our work is much more expansive. Our process is much more expansive. The way nature tackles complexity. There's a lot of research, not to go off on another subject, but nature has these systems that are in nature where there's a lot of processing going on. And the complexities tackled in nature in tiny pulses of complexity. So when they're put together, you have a complex system, right? And that's something that I research on my own and I've been discussing a lot. So what the impact that has is when you break down those narratives as tiny pulses and you put them together, you have a big continuous system, hopefully, right? A well thought out plan to start developing. So you're tackling complexity. Now you're focusing on your design guidelines, right? After all that narrative work per se. And of course, you want to test early, test often, right? Test your designs on tablets as soon as possible. I'm always big on rethinking UI strategies, UI design strategies, and getting stuff on tablets in front of the user just to validate an idea or a prototype, right? And then now we can focus on those micro interactions. We put together pattern libraries, right, which is every possible permutation of a component, of type, of error messages, of input fields, all these controls. And so now you've broken down your app from the top narrative down to the micro interaction. Hopefully it offers a strategy, as a way to rethink how we work. And of course, now you can skip more or less on visual design work, and you can focus on putting those micro interactions into code directly. I'm big on using single-page applications, and the advantage of this is that you have everything loaded up in one page, right? All your CSS is pre-processed and compiled in one page, right? All your JavaScript is compiled from CoffeeScript in one page, right? All your templating, HTML template is all in one page. So when the user has to go through the workflow or through the different components, it's just one page that keeps reloading, right? Different parts of it. So they don't have to navigate through different sites. So it's a way to design fast and prototype your app faster. And so I use the Mimosa JS framework, which I've been exposed to at Berico, and the lead developer for that is David Bashford. Say hi, David. Don't hide. So it's a very advantageous tool to use when you're working with single-page applications, right? And I'll quickly demonstrate how we do this UX prototyping, right? Laura Klein says that you might be bummed out if your idea fails in an afternoon of coding. But guess what? It's better than finding it out with months of coding, right? So it's kind of easy to gauge where do you want to fail, right? Like if you have these narratives, you code up the micro interactions, you put them in a few sequences, in one page, and you test it and you find out that you're wrong. That's preferable than leading your team down the wrong path of development, right? By focusing on that data model too early on and anchoring those interactions. So there's a lot of advantages to prototyping directly from your design stories, from your sketches. So here's a design story. I admit it just looks like a whiteboard sketch. But for the folks involved in this, there's enough information as far as context, right? What we were targeting. We were designing a filing system, so you can kind of make out some of those shapes. And we have enough information to include the usability factors. So these design stories don't have to be several pages in a sketchbook for each of the sections. It could be a whole wall, an entire room, which is kind of the way we already work. So it's just more or less redefining those sections, right? Remember, context, system, usability, and visual design. And just putting them together in a way that flows better. So these are some of our design stories. We do a ton of whiteboarding, like most of you. We're just trying to make sense of these, right? And here's our approach at creating that simultaneous interface that provided the big three, right? Definition, contextualization, and visualization. And we're trying to provide that easy navigation, that personalized workflow. So, as designers, we're brave enough, we're coding that up directly from the sketches, right? So you probably recognize this. This is the J templating, right? So you're writing less code, and you're just skipping that Photoshop mock-up stage, and you're just coding it directly and putting it on a single-page application framework or an SPA. You're putting it in a mobile browser, and you're testing it. And then we add our SAS, and we can get really fancy, right, with the pre-processed CSS. And and then also very important, we always want to think about the user, right? I mean, and that helps us to achieve reflective design, reflective experiences. And how I can't express it better than what Erica Hall recently wrote in her book, Just Enough Research. She says, personas will keep you honest. You design for them, not for you or your boss, right? And so that's kind of like you're always thinking about the user, right? So we haven't just completely forsaken the user with our design story. It's still about the user. We just don't call it user story anymore because there's so much more to it. And so here's some of our prototypes. I can't really show you a lot of the app. It's for Intel, and it's not necessarily public. But here's kind of like some of the micro interactions we were designing for the filing system. And it's for analysts to look at these stories that come in and act on them. And here's our plan. Of course, we want to go cross-device. We want to be relevant to the domain, and all those design principles that sit at the top of the design stories. So lessons learned. There's a lot of analysis we want to provide. But again, if we're not thinking about the users and that complexity, it's almost like heading for an iceberg, right? Because you're just seeing what's on top. There's so much more underneath. And I think design stories, not user stories, can help us get to that underneath, to really see and achieve that innovation and that potential. So what's next for design stories, right? No pun intended to the sprint. Okay. So we want to do more than issue tracking, right? We don't just want to. We want to rethink. Maybe we're writing stories. So is there a way to digitize these design stories to ensure that collaboration and promote what I call hyper collaboration? We're cross-functional teams. So is there a way to digitize that script card and that exercise? I hope to have given some ideas. And as a design community, I know there's a lot of potential. Stefan Anderson wrote about a sense of vision, and I'm really big on design visualization, narratives for design visualization. I think there's a lot of potential to be achieved. And Stefan Anderson suggests, focusing on patterns and subtle differences, and our brain have this ability to focus on conceptual metaphors, right? Which is what we're doing when we're building an infographic, when we're thinking about the context of our systems, of our app, is something that we can put together and have those narratives for design visualization. I think that's, frankly, what's next for design stories. And it's really big right now, stories for a smart world, or smart world stories. We live in there's all this interconnectedness happen, and so we want to really fill in the gaps between what are those experiences between devices, between people, humans and devices. Right? And a user story is not going to get you there. A million user stories won't get you there. Design stories, I propose, will, because they help us think holistically. Right? We're kind of showing a way to reevaluate how we think about the narratives. And so Carla Diana, she's a big voice in the IoT, Internet of Things, and she says that what exists today hasn't scratched the surface of possibility. And so I think that possibility lies in those narratives. Kind of like the screenwriters just kind of set off the making of a documentary, of a film. I think those design stories can kind of set off a lot of potential. Thank you so much for your time. I hope to offer some good food for thought. Thank you. So any comments, feedback, questions? I know. Yeah, go ahead. What do you mean by information? Okay, going into biomimicry, for instance, the way nature achieves symmetry, right? For instance, between flowers and a bee, right? A bee is normally doesn't have that great of a vision, but is able to recognize the symmetry of a flower and is able to get on it. So symmetry is the information of the natural world, right? And there's a lot of experts, people way brighter than me, that philosophize on this, and actually there's maths involved, how nature achieves symmetry. And so I'm big on transferring those concepts from nature, and biomimicry does this with engineering to achieve that information symmetry, where a system, an interface, speaks to a user, is relevant to them, not because we're just designing a clever form, but because of how we work, how we put in the workflow and the user flow, and how we're designing the interface. It takes into account their life and what they go through. And that is also the language of a system. There's so many factors, right? So it's a good one to look up, actually. So I hope that gives you an idea. Yeah? All right. There's a hand back there. Yeah?
You create design stories, and what's the daily interaction with developers? What is that like? Can you repeat the question?
Yes. With design stories, what has been my interaction with developers? They're much more engaged. I won't say any names, but it's so rewarding when I hear a developer say, "I just want to tell a good search story," and I know I've done it, because it's not like so much this list that the PMs just pound on you to check off tasks. and and then maybe you're going down the wrong path of development, but you're almost helping developers. Well, I know you're working with developers, right? You're learning from them. It's cross-functional, and you're promoting design thinking. So that has been one particular experience I had. Normally they're much more receptive, but that'd be a good one.
I think that maybe what I was getting at was when you have this vision, have these design stories, and then it goes to code, right? So what is that transition like? What does it look like? If I'm a developer and you're the designer, you've done the design stories and you're working with me, how does that interact?
Yeah.
Go on a silo and do
Nope.
come back?
Nope. GitHub, man. You get it all on GitHub, so it's transparent. And and developers like you when you break stuff less and less on GitHub, because you have to update Node or whatever. So that's the form of the design stories in code, and it's a good way of collaboration for code. Okay, that connection, that's the messy part of it. It's like it exists like in everybody's head, but it's in code, and it's in all these design stories. And it's an opportunity for designers to make their work known, to really fill out the hallways with sketches, right? And these narratives. So, it includes developers as well. Yes?
So just to follow up to that, so my interest with this lies in going up from a design story and going down to the rest. So with typical agile, you have the epics, you have the user stories, and you have the tasks associated with them. So the tasks, you want them to have as granular as possible. What I understand now is that you take epics away, which is fine. You just have a design story and then break that down to other design stories, break that to other design stories. The question is, at some point in time, I need to know as a developer what you as a, I don't know, UI developer, whatever, designer, whatever. We kind of need to know, we know who does what, but how do you, you kind of need tasks, right? Not just be like the square in the room. You gotta need tasks.
I understand your concern, yeah.
I'm associated with them, some sort of relationship between other tasks. I block something else. Like, that's my concern. I love the idea, but that's my concern. Like, how do you deal with that part?
I'll know how to update my presentation now. So yeah, that's something that I do give that a lot of thought to. And yeah, I don't know if perhaps it's definitely more than issue tracking. That's where I want to see it. But then how to engage the developers, and how you're saying how to handle the task aspect of it. I think that's where we can take the design stories to the digital form, so that it exists in in a more relevant form that can be applied. I think that's what's exciting, for me. Yeah, totally TBD. Yeah. So. Yeah. There's a hand in the back. Sorry.
I was wondering, what do you do if you were dealing with an application that's not mostly about the interface and how the users like it? How do you deal with things like business rules and stories have acceptance criteria? How do you know when you achieve what you need to do, especially if some of that is more in development logic?
Yeah, excellent point. Right now I'm thinking that system part, right, the bottom left quadrant, and that will include that information. And then I would imagine each of those concerns or stages would be their own design story, essentially. But I know what you mean. If they're not essentially involving UI, if it's more like API. Yeah, and that's what I think with stories for a smart world. I think that changes. It includes some of those considerations. When you have devices talking to each other and there's different APIs interacting. I think that could benefit from design thinking, certainly. I mean, I say that as a designer bias, but yeah. But that's a good point. Yeah, just a little bit. And yes.
So when you're working in the intelligence community or the government at large, how do you actually convince the customers to put the emphasis and carve out the time to focus on design and put this out front?
Yeah, we've been very fortunate. We have subject matter experts that used to be in those roles. So they work their connections, I guess, and we just have great products. We've gotten a lot of clout for our experience design work, and we're doing more and more of it. But it all started from an interface that everybody liked, and you kind of get clout, you know. So that's been like our exposure to that aspect of it. And yeah, David, go ahead. Use the lead on the budget.
Part of it is just being awesome. Like, that's a bit crazy to say, but you know, not jotting it all down in Jira up front so that they can see it is a bit of a buy-in at the outset. But I think when they see the beginnings of something turning into something, they're bought in, and they're not necessarily worried about all the stories being Jira. That's not to say that you get rid of your tracking system. Like, you still need your tracking system to log bugs and log like the details, especially if you're talking about stuff on backend and services. You still need that stuff. I think you still need to be able to. And one of the reasons you need that stuff is because the QA team needs to see it, so they know what to test. This stuff probably isn't as useful for a QA engineer to take it and move to the next step.
I think for me, without a real world example, it's just hard to pick the overall, like how everything fits together, how it fits together.
We're really lucky that Luis, aside from being a really good designer, is actually a pretty good developer.
You blew my cover, man.
So don't. Yeah, make sure to ask like hardcore JavaScript questions. But I think that.
I just make things look pretty. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I mean, he uses the tools that we have, oftentimes he takes the design story that he creates and ends up creating an interface for it. A lot of times before you. So if you ask about developer buy-in, it's really easy to develop buy-in, especially most web engineers don't want to do what a web designer does. I don't want to spend a lot of time writing markup. I don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about the CSS. Because someone else has taken sort of the story we put in place and sort of turned it into something that's living, and I can focus on writing code, all that.
So prototyping is the most part of design.
It doesn't have to be. I think Luis has a pretty unique skill set, and I think there are probably a lot of designers that are uncomfortable stepping in and doing the hardcore development that he does. But I think someone has to step in to level, turn what is a story into something that is living. And as soon as you have something that has something to it.
Yeah, that's been the trend for a couple of years, as the designer who codes, right? There's so much adulation over that, but it actually brings a lot of value to what we do. Yeah.
Something that we found helps us answer your question is, and I think you mentioned at one point validation. Anytime we have a chance to talk, in our case, they're publishers who are, and to talk to them and run some of these ideas past them, these concepts and case stories, that helps a lot. You can do some initial buy-in, some initial validation with some customers, then you can go back and say, look, this is the process we're doing, we'd like to do more of it, and here are some examples of how it's really resonated with some of the people that we care about. It can be easier then to say, and then now we'd like to do this stuff, and it can help.
Any more comments or feedback or questions? Yes.
One more add-on to that. So, based on what you were saying, it sounds to me like this may be a good way of turning design stories into something that resembles more of the workflow when it comes to deliverables. And that is, if you work on the UI first, you have to mark up CSS, and then some of that gets done, and then it moves on to the UI developer, so that gets done, and then the backend services that gets done. So is that what you're talking about? That you just kind of add on?
I'm sure that's what I'm talking about. That is the result.
Yeah, it's how.
But that seems to me like the only way that you can mark the difference between the various worlds.
Yeah, I think that's the workflow we have. I also think I'm not a designer, so there's a lot of like squishy design stuff that goes on, a lot of UX stuff like that I don't understand it really well. I just write code, but that's what ends up coming out the other side. It's the exact process.
And there was a comment here. Yes.
Oh yeah. I wanted to thank you. I really like that you took a stab.
That's what about, yeah.
and I think there's a lot of value in it. I think having it be an enterprise-wide process has real challenges. I know we've seen the two things that really stuck out for me were the motivational aspects of this, that get every part of the team behind it and have ownership. I've seen that happen. If you create a system to do that, I think that's awesome. I'd correct you on films. After the script's done, you recruit an A-list actor, and that's the second step you do. That kind of leads me to my next question.
That's David Bashford right there. That's weird.
You,
You're the A-list actor. I'm sorry.
how do you, so a lot of us, working maybe in private industry, we have business plans and business goals and profit motive and
The bottom line.
we don't have budgets, but
Right.
how would you incorporate that kind of filter on top of your user process, user studio?
Yeah, IBM's done it recently. They're making design thinking pervasive, and it's IBM, right, in their organization. And I've been, and you can. There's a slide share presentation from their design lead. I can share the link with you just to have an idea. But there's very specific things that apply at the enterprise corporate level and how to get that done. It's a very different world than just a small cross-functional team in a startup. Completely realize it. But yeah, thanks about your other point about the motivation aspect. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just about. I'll post the slide share. I will look up every one of those authors that I mentioned: Vince Lombardi, Lane Haley, Laura Klein, Carla Diana, Stefan Anderson, and there's a lot of resources. Also, there's a few folks from the Node.js side of things who work within like lean methods and work in these cross-functional teams for that rapid prototyping. And definitely, I'll post that up. But I think it's picking up momentum a lot, actually, right? And I think there's potential for redefining the narratives also. But yep. Yeah. Yes.
So if you're at a small technology startup, you haven't placed any emphasis on design outside of developers muster up. Where are great places to get started for getting that brain and that design focus and that like how would you go about trying to start up a design practice and workshop them in out of it? And any tips for creating and establishing best practices and finding the resources?
Yeah, that answer requires a consulting fee, but we can discuss my fee. No, there's a lot of resources and examples of how that's done. I mentioned the IBM example, and there's a few others. Also, that's part of why I'm glad to be here at NoVA UX, because we're part of a community. So get your people out to the local meetups. And I have to say, this is one of the nicest meetup groups, and I've been to a lot of meetup groups all over the world, and I think it's one of the nicest. And I think we have a lot of potential to be a force to be reckoned with in the East Coast. So I'm super excited to present today. So yeah, we can talk about my fee if you want. Okay, question in the back. That's great. It's almost like a parallel thought or parallel effort. So it's product canvas. I'll look it up. Everyone, jot that down. Product canvas. Thank you for that. Any other comments? or questions? David. You want the mic, man? I see him every day, so I can talk like this to him. So.
I just think it's like, yeah, my thoughts. I think the transformation for us, you know, before we start we have more analysts we gather requirements, they come back and better. And then after they were done sticking on stuff, then the options came together. Okay, how would you build? How would you apply that matches all the and I think the way we flipped it is we did right to sound and requirements that we have, like how can we build an application takes care of those requirements. And after we built the UI, you know, then we start jotting stuff down. So and we don't put it in the user story form. So it's good stuff.
It lists as a prototype that's clickable, a clickable prototype. Essentially, it's like the artifact.
So I mean, you get together and you iterate down the application that moves types. It takes 4 months, like once a week, yeah, 5 or 6. To get to a point where we felt like we had the UI where we wanted to be. Once we had the UI where we wanted to be is when we started like pushing requirements down the stack. We had the UI now I can go to the services and say, hey, I have to do service. Because the UI we want to build.
Yeah, that's real life. Yeah, a lot of live coding sessions sometimes. So. Yeah, I guess David should have been my co-presenter at this point, like talking, which is great. Any other comments or questions? Yes. In those rows. It's limited. A lot of the feedback we get is anecdotal. I tend not to trust it. I like metrics. So I mean, there's metrics that you can. It's written about extensively, right? Like how to measure the user experience from Swinson. It's the last name of the author. But yeah, that's the way we kind of have those metrics that we think will drive the success, right? From talking about their experiences. And we're talking to people that have been all over the world, you know, in different missions or different command centers. So we kind of have good insight into what will drive the success. But then it's like validating it, getting in front of users or potential client, in-house testing of sorts. Did I just say that? Sorts. It's an inside joke. And it's a way that's our validation. You know, it's like on the ground. It's real life. You know, it's fast too. So, but there's ways to do it and get more quantitative information, focusing on those usability metrics, right? Like how you're measuring the tasks. If you can get that in there, it would be great. So that's been our experience. So. And this is the nature of the domain, you know. So, but we think good experience, good UX, and of course that's why those personas are important. They don't live in somebody's head, you know. They're out there. They're real world. Yep. Any other comments or suggestions or questions?